Exception handling. Exceptions are runtime errors, that is, errors that occur at runtime. When you are executing your program, errors can occur, like you are trying to downcast an object which is of a wrong type. You get a class cast exception. You are trying to access a file beyond its length. You are trying end of file exception. You are trying to convert a string which is alphanumeric using the parseInt method. You get number format exception. You are trying to access a method which is not in the scope, illegal access exception. You are trying to access a object variable member of some object, but that object is not actually referencing anywhere, it's still null, so you get null pointer exception. Trying to access an array beyond the length, you get array index out of bounds exception. Trying to divide by 0, arithmetic exception. So how do you handle these errors? Of course you can write your if-else statements, but if-else becomes too complex because you end up having a lot of nestings and code readability becomes difficult. So exception handling makes things easier for you to read your code and handle these errors. What happens if I don't handle these errors? Let's say I try to read an array beyond its length. An exception is thrown. Whatever the exception is thrown, that error message is displayed and program execution ends abruptly. So I wouldn't want to come out of program execution just because of some error in my code. I might want to continue after that error with some other path of execution. So how do I handle this and follow through some other path of execution? That is what exception handling is going to talk about. To handle exceptions, you use the try-catch block. In the try block, you write set of instructions which might throw exception. Then you write a catch block. In the catch block, you specify the exception type that you want to handle or that might be raised. You capture the exception object that might have been raised and specify the instructions to be executed when an exception has occurred. And optionally, you have a finally block. For a try block, you can have any number of catch blocks depending on what type of exceptions you want to handle. So for every type of exception you might have a separate catch block, but for a try there can only be one finally block. For one try, one finally block. The finally block gets executed regardless of an exception. We'll come back to the finally block little later. When I'm specifying for a try block a catch with an exception which I want to capture, let's say arithmetic exception, and let's say I have a catch block for null pointer exception. I have a catch for, let's say, file not found exception. Then I might have a catch block for IO exception. And a catch for runtime exception. Catch for exception. Now, before we can talk about all these catch blocks, let us understand that an exception is nothing but classes. So you have different exception classes. You have class object. From this object class, there is a throwable class which is derived. From this throwable class, you have an error class and an exception class. So from this exception class, all the different types of exceptions are derived. So you have your runtime exception, you have your IO exception, you have your SQL exception, etc. derived from your exception class. Okay, from runtime exception, some of the examples of runtime exception are null pointer exception, arithmetic exception, array index out of bounds exception, illegal access exception. They all come under a runtime exception. Examples of IO exception, you have file not found exception, end of file exception, socket exception, etc. There are two types of exceptions. You have checked and unchecked exceptions. What I mean by checked exception is that during compilation time, the compiler checks to see whether the exception is being handled or not. That is a checked exception. Unchecked exceptions are those which the compiler does not bother to check during compilation whether you are handling those exceptions or not. Examples of checked exception are your SQL exception, IO exception, and whatever other exceptions are available. Example of unchecked exception are all your runtime exceptions. All runtime exceptions are unchecked exceptions. So now coming back to a try having multiple catch blocks, when I specify multiple catch for a try, I have to take care that if there is a parent-child relationship between the catch blocks, between the exceptions in the catch block, like for example, file not found exception is a child class of IO exception. So I am having both the file not found exception and the IO exception catch block. So when I have this parent and child relationship, we need to make sure that the child exception comes first and then the parent exception catch block. Otherwise the compiler will give an error saying catch not reached.